Welcome back to the Public Rail Now podcast. It's Adam. I'm very excited to talk with economist Omer Tayyab about nationalizing industries, corporate influence in the economic field, degrowth, trends in neoliberalism, and so much more. I have links to where you can find out more about Omer's work in the episode description. So thanks for listening and hope you enjoy.
My name is Omer Tayyab, and I'm a researcher at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology. This is an institute with the Autonomous University of Barcelona, so that's where I'm based at, in Barcelona. My background is in economics, like mostly mainstream economics. I worked in various economics advisory roles in the public services in Canada. I was in a couple of provinces, Alberta and Ontario. So some of your listeners might know Alberta as the oil province in Canada, and Ontario is the more finance capital, I suppose. And I was in a few different roles, ranging from macroeconomic and fiscal analysis to transportation analysis over the years. And as I went through those roles, I started to observe the limits of mainstream perspectives in economics, and started getting myself educated on more heterodox economics ideas. And I found a lot of useful material there in terms of let's say explanatory power for the world we live in, right? So that eventually led me to the field of post-growth, and an opportunity came along with the project I'm with right now, Project Real. I think we'll talk about it at some point later in the podcast. And I decided to move to Barcelona for the project. Before that, I was living in Toronto, so for this project, I moved to Barcelona. It's been about a year and a half. Here, my main areas of research interest, I suppose, broadly defined, are economics and ecology from a global south perspective mainly. So I try to map the relationship between the global north and the global south in terms of dependencies in order to inform policies mainly for global south governments, but also sometimes I focus on global north as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the program. Just to get us started, you had mentioned doing work in post-growth, and earlier I did an interview with Charles Stevenson, and we talked about degrowth and what that kind of looks like. And I'd love to get your basic definition of degrowth or post-growth and what that might look like in different contexts. So, you had mentioned working mostly with Global South, but in different, geographical, political, and economic contexts, what does degrowth mean, and what does it look like?
All right, that's a good question, and shout out to Charles if he's listening to it. He's a colleague of mine. So I would define degrowth as a transition from a growth-obsessed and growth-dependent economy to a post-growth economy through an equitable reduction in the energy and material throughput of the global economy while ensuring good lives for all, right? So it is a process, it is transitory process, degrowth, where we leave capitalism in the past, understanding that capitalism is simply not compatible with a sustainable mode of human existence. So I use the word equitable there. And for me, degrowth is inseparable from global justice, right? We know from several empirical studies now that the responsibility for the climate crisis, as well as the multiple humanitarian crises around the world right now, like the Gaza genocide, the responsibility for these crises lie at the feet of the rich elites and rich nations of the planet, right? So it's not, everybody's not equally responsible here. Some people in some nations more so than others. And of course, by that I mean that global north is mainly responsible. We also know that as a whole, the global north consumes far more than its fair share of resources, and is responsible for far more of the environmental impacts. Yeah. So a very good example is greenhouse gases emitted into the environment. And if we measure the stock of greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution, the beginning, like early 1800s or whatnot, when humans started pumping these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we find that the overwhelming percentage is due to global warming, because that's primarily where Industrial Revolution took place, right? So of course, there's a geographical difference in where the reductions that degrowth proposes would happen, right? So when I define degrowth, I said I use the word equitable, but I also use the word reduction in energy and material throughput. So the reductions are mainly going to be located in the global north, which overconsumes, because it would be unfair to ask people of the global south to reduce their consumption when it is overwhelmingly rich people in the north who are driving overconsumption and who are responsible for the climate and planetary crisis. And also, I think I'll add that from a political perspective, degrowth is not like a separate movement, or it's not separate from the broader progressive movement. And a lot of the demands actually overlap with the larger package of demands made by progressives, like universal basic income, or a job guarantee, or decommodified basic services, right? A lot of your listeners might have heard some of those terms during Zoran Mamdani's campaign for mayor of NYC. So a lot of degrowth demands also overlap with that. What degrowth brings is a particular understanding of the economy, where it links undesirable social outcomes and unsustainable throughput of material and energy to the way we currently organize economic activities. And then it proposes a new logic for economic organization, a logic based on a need satisfaction, a logic based on sufficiency, particularly private sufficiency. And there might be luxury in public goods, but on the private front, degrowth focuses more on the sufficiency side of economics. So what degrowth is doing really is it's adding a layer of sufficiency oriented economics to the broader progressive agenda. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And in speaking of this sort of developing the public sphere, and our campaign, Public Rail Now, our main focus is the nationalization of the U.S. rail system, which is unique in the world that it's almost completely lock, stock, and barrel owned by
Right.
massive private companies. And so I wanted to pick your brain about nationalization. What are the economic and social benefits of nationalization or expanding public institutions versus private, and what are some of the reasons that different peoples and different governments, different movements have pursued the path of nationalization?
All right, that's a great question. I think before I talk about nationalization, I think it is important to underscore what we mean by that term, right? Because does nationalization simply mean that instead of the private sector, the government is doing the same thing? I don't think you mean that. I don't think I mean that. So probably good to clarify that bit, right? What we mean by nationalization, or what we want with nationalization, is that the underlying logic of the service being provided, or the underlying logic of the good being produced, needs to be changed. And I'll try to explain what I mean. Like I said, I spent a lot of time in Canada. In Alberta, there's a pipeline that was proposed by a it's called the TMX pipeline, Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. It was proposed by a private company. And when the project looked like it would not be allowed to go through because of it was not meeting environmental standards properly, the federal government actually stepped in and bought it, right? So they bought an oil pipeline which was in contradiction of environmental laws, which was in contradiction to indigenous rights in that area, and they bought it just so that they could shore up private financiers and private capital in that province, because the oil and gas industry, like I said, is big in Alberta, right? So to give confidence to that particular group, the federal government actually stepped in and nationalized something. So is that the kind of nationalization we are talking about? I don't think I am. right? Another example we can think about is, let's say the example of Boeing, which is a private company that is performing incredibly poorly these days, right? Planes falling out of the skies and door panels coming off mid-flight. So it's a company with an incredibly storied past, and it's very bizarre to see it perform like this, right? And it's strategically important to the United States government. So let's say they decide to nationalize it and buy off the shareholders. But if the government is going to operate it under the same imperative, like let's say using it to develop advanced military aircraft that will be then used to bomb innocent people, then that's probably not something we would support as progressives, right? So I think the question of nationalization cannot really be separated from political struggles, and I'd emphasize that nationalization itself should be seen as a tactic and not an end goal per se, right? It's not just enough to nationalize something. There should be a broader political movement behind it that is seeking to change the underlying logic of the enterprise that is being nationalized, right? So when we think about nationalization in this way, what are we trying to do? Is it to provide a particular benefit to the people, right? Is it something that is needed by the people? What is the primary purpose of the enterprise? Once we answer these questions, there can be immense benefits of nationalization. The biggest one is that you can plan for the long term, right? I use the example of Boeing. One of the reasons it has gone down the toilet is that the management is beholden to quarterly results, right? And if investors on Wall Street and elsewhere see an activity that requires a cash outlay that doesn't generate a return immediately, they can pull out their money, which can crash the stock and creates this pressure where management must constantly prioritize short-term returns over long-term planning, right? Coming specifically to rail, we know that it can be the rail system can be incredibly efficient and a preferable mode of transportation. We see evidence of this all over the world, right? It is also fairly old now and also pretty mature tech. Even the high-speed rail stuff is pretty mature at this point. So it can be implemented quite easily if there's a decision-making structure that prioritizes building it, right? But because the U.S. Structure is such that it does not care about the large masses of population that it rules over, these projects never seem to take off, right? California HSR is a great example because if the state doesn't have any capacity to build it, it has to rely on profit-driven private individual contractors, which leads to inefficiencies and corner cutting as each layer tries to maximize profits for itself. So I think this benefit of nationalization lies in its ability to long-term plan. And if there's a progressive movement that is controlling the state and the long-term planning structure, it can really use a nationalized enterprise to meet those goals. Something like a public rail system would be incredible for a country like the United States because transportation-based emissions are so high over there, right? And many of the trips that are made through either cars or through airplanes could actually be made through much more energy efficient ways through rail. I think so. So this long-term planning bit, I think, is the biggest advantage of nationalization. But there's another very big benefit, which is setting high labor standards for private operators in the same industry, right? This is where there can be a benefit of competition. If there's a large firm, a nationalized firm offering good wages and good working conditions, it would create pressure on other firms to follow suit or risk losing their best employees. So that's, I think, also a very big benefit that nationalization in an industry like rail could have. Lastly, I think another benefit I would like to touch upon is creation of other smaller supplier industries and creation of this kind of knowledge base that is good to provide jobs and grow an economy for the people who are in that particular region, right? So I talked about high-speed rail, which does not exist in any capacity in the U.S., like in any meaningful capacity. But if there were a national U.S. rail operator that decided to go all in on HSR, it inevitably won't be able to source and build every single component on its own, right? Which would create demand for other smaller and more specialized players to step in. And this already happens with, for example, the auto industry in the US, right, where the presence of big firms has allowed a whole host of smaller players to exist. So in this way, I think nationalization and planned expansion into new areas could develop new expertise and even new industries. And we see something like this happening in China, right, which has gone from having no high-speed rail to becoming the leader within just like 25 years or so. So I think a lot has to be said how a large nationalized firm could spur development of the industrial base and the knowledge base within the workforce.
I really love that you brought up the sort of, making it clear what we mean by nationalization, because it's definitely our understanding when we use that term. We're also talking about empowering the workers. It's not just kind of creating in another unaccountable state bureaucratic institution that, like you mentioned, even if we had government control of the railroads instead of the private sector, that doesn't mean that munitions aren't going to be shipped.
Right.
Like, there are all
Right.
these different consequences. But yeah, one of the things that we highlight in our literature and in our conversations with folks is that from what we mean when we say nationalization is empowering the people that actually do the work, that actually give their labor to it, giving them the power to make decisions along with those people that are impacted by it. So we're thinking of trackside communities, basically the entire public, which we would hope not only nationalize the industry but also democratize it. This
Right.
massive constantly inching towards monopoly. There's this merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern coming around the corner. So kind of taking it out of an unaccountable private short-term profit sphere and bringing it under the control of the public and the people that actually do the work. So I'm really glad that you made that that distinction there. And speaking of that, like, are there any what successful precedents have you seen established in sort of pursuing that type of goal, like in terms of how major industries have been brought under public control by different peoples, different governments over time? I guess, like, what are the different paths that can be taken towards bringing a major industry under the control of the public and democratizing it?
Right. I think this kind of event in many different locations has happened only through some kind of political struggle. So I can take the example of the Canadian health system, which did not used to be a public healthcare system. It did not used to be a universal healthcare system, and how that happened. So it really started in Saskatchewan, and with the Social Democratic premier over there back in the 1940s, I think around 1945, 47, something around that, where he implemented universal public health care insurance for the province, and he made it the first jurisdiction with universal health coverage in North America, actually. It was only linked to hospital care at the beginning, but then it expanded to include all of physician services, broadly defined. But why he did it is a very personal story for this guy, because when he was a kid, he had an injury, and he was unable to access medical services, and he would have lost a limb, basically. I think he would have lost a leg or something. But what changed for him was that one doctor agreed to do the surgery for free, only if the parents let other medical students watch the procedure, right? So this was a very, like, a unique arrangement that happened. And so that guy basically took that to heart, and he understood that, well, if that doctor had not made this deal with my parents, I would have lost a leg. And so he understood that, and when he became premier, he campaigned, and he campaigned towards universal healthcare provision. And so when this happened, and this happened, by the way, in a smaller province of Canada. This is Saskatchewan. This is not Ontario. This is not Quebec. This is not even Alberta, right? These would be the population-wise and even economy-wise larger provinces of Canada, but it didn't happen there. It started out of Saskatchewan. But when people from other provinces saw this, there's like, well, hey, we can we should also have these services. And so along protracted political struggle took place, I think, all the way up to the 80s, where finally Canada was able to put in place a universal, publicly funded healthcare system. So it's not nationalized at this point still. Hospitals and caregiving services are most of them are independent, not nonprofits, and the schedule of prices is determined, but the schedule of prices is determined by the governments. So provincial and territorial governments set the prices for medical procedures in Canada, and they negotiate with the local medical associations, and these fee schedules then become specific to each province and detail the payment for physician services and so on and so forth. But the point is that government involvement in this very very needed area, like healthcare is needed by everybody, was instrumental in making sure that a universal coverage system could be put into place. There are other examples too. So this example I mentioned because there was a long political struggle behind it. Another example is UK nationalizing a lot of its industries after the Second World War, and again, there's a long baggage of failures of what you'd say private market and private corporations, leading to this end where the Labour government comes in the UK, which was very much unlike the Labour government that it is in place right now. But that's a different topic. But in any case, that Labour government then was able to nationalize key industries like coal, like railways, because there was this political power that they had behind them, right? So, like in all of the cases that I see some kind of political movement leading towards a nationalization. And another a more violent example would be the Chinese Revolution, right, where the Communist Party took over and basically dissolved all previous forms of land ownership and took all the land in the control of the nation itself. So I think, like, when we see how these kinds of nationalization efforts have successfully been implemented, I think there's always some kind of large political movement and some political turmoil happening behind it. Without that, I don't think that has ever happened. Like somebody just woke up and decided to nationalize a key industry. I don't think that has happened.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up this really important element of this, the political struggle. And what I wanted to ask is just sort of to kind of dig in a little deeper here. We can kind of see just from our conversation thus far that there's, of course, like a great public interest at stake in something like nationalization, in turning a major industry or institution into a force that operates for the benefit of the public, and instead of profit making. And so, in the past and present, who have people typically struggled against? The big players that are opposed to nationalization, both in the global north and some of the maybe elite spheres in the global south that have latched onto global north initiatives.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think mostly the sort of the adversaries to nationalization have always been the entrenched interests. So it's mostly been the large owners of large corporations, private capital, that has usually been the sort of the enemy of nationalization. And there's two reasons for this. One is obviously that nationalization means a switchover of property rights from a small group to a larger group, but also it means that all the profits that accumulate through the ownership, they also get transferred over, right? So there's a very strong economic interest for the private capitalists to oppose anything like nationalization. And on the flip side, you in fact see them going more towards these ideas of privatization, right? These ideas that government cannot do anything well, so things should be privatized. And so what you see in this struggle is that large corporations from the mostly from the global north would have these ideas of privatization, where they would come in and, let's say, there's a resource that can be exploited in a global south country, and then they form a private consortium, pay a bit of royalty to the local elites that they have cultivated in the country, and then cash out on the basis of that. So I think the enemies of nationalization, I think, usually have been big capitalists within both international and locally. So one very good example that comes to my mind is the nationalization of so-called British oil in Iran, right? So under the government at that time, Mohammad Mossadegh, when he, I think this was in the late 50s, if I'm not mistaken, when he took over and decided to use Iran's oil wealth for Iran itself, that didn't go too well with the global North countries, the powerful countries of the time, and they instigated a coup in which the popular premier was killed. So I think, yeah, it's both global and it's local. Like you might see in the context of US, you would see the large capitalists of today, like somebody like Bill Gates or an Elon Musk. They would be extremely extremely scared and extremely antagonistic towards ideas of nationalization.
Yeah, it's actually funny thinking about uh, people like Elon Musk and these folks, because Elon Musk has said a little while ago that he wants to privatize everything that can be privatized, which is kind of comical in a I guess in a sad way, thinking of the people of Argentina, because they have Milei, who just won swept an election, unfortunately, which I'm sure was because of US interference and assistance and what have you, but that's another story. But his sort of I think what Milei calls anarcho-capitalists, just privatize everything. They ended up having to get this $40 billion bailout from the United States, and so it's I somebody had made this quip, but in looking at the sanctions against somewhere like Venezuela, but then a bailout for Argentina, it's like is nationalization really failing if you have to cripple it with sanctions
Right,
and you have
right,
to bail
exactly.
out? Yeah, you have to bail out mass privatization. But and I do want to keep on with this sort of global north and global south conversation, but because you mentioned it, as an economist, can you speak about why in the economics discipline, especially in places like the US, there tends to be this dogmatic leaning towards that, the private sector is good, the government can't do anything right, the public sector is bad, it's inefficient. Why does that persist?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty large question to answer, I think, but I can probably touch upon some of the possible main reasons for that. I think one of the big reasons is that the media is basically corporate owned, right? And it's not really interested in doing good journalism or challenging the status quo. It's more interested in keeping the status quo, right? So you may have some pockets of, like, what you might call controlled opposition there, but generally when it comes to main economic material conditions, it's usually the same ideas get I would say propounded to the extent that it becomes as like breathing air, right? So if you pick a regular person in the US and you ask them, well, is private better than a nationally operated enterprise, and they would most likely answer that the private is better, and that's more due to the propaganda that gets churned out of the corporate media, I think, than anything else. It just has become it's such a propagandized country that it has become this common sense to assume that, yeah, of course the government cannot do anything, of course nationalization is bad, of course bureaucrats government bureaucrats are inept. Never mind all the examples that you see of people like I mentioned the example of Boeing, right? You see all those examples, but never mind that. You just discard everything like that out of your mind and just think about what the propaganda is saying, right? So I think it's a lot of that has to do with the media, and I think there's also a lot of funding that goes by rich corporations towards ideologies favoring them, and it just doesn't happen in the media. It also happens in academia. So you see people like, back in the day, people like Milton Friedman, who were very, free market oriented and neoliberals of their times. You'd see that their departments and their universities would get these extra bits of funding from corporate donors, whereas obviously people who are doing research that would be detrimental to corporate interests, they don't get as much funding. And so over the years, what has happened is that all the critical voices have been sidelined in economics, right? So back in the day, in the 70s, in the 60s, you could actually see even Marxist economics publishing in top economics journals, but that just doesn't happen anymore, right? It's just a few people, or at least a few schools that you see appearing in the same journals over and over, which are the top ones. I remember reading this study and a news article around that study, which talked about how concentrated the Nobel Prize for economics has become. It's just basically just like these 8 elite US institutions, whereas all the other physical sciences, ones like chemistry, like physics, they have become unconcentrated. So it's as knowledge has spread around the world, you see Nobel Prize winners from many different parts of the world and many different parts of many different universities, in physics and chemistry, in other physical sciences, but you don't see that happening in economics. Economics goes in a completely opposite trend, where it's been more and more concentrated in these few schools. So I think that's kind of what's playing out there, because economics is more of a, I mean, mainstream economics tries to pretend it is a science. There's a lot of ideology behind it, really. And there are a lot of unquestioned assumptions that go into it. So I think because of this particular kind of funding model that is in place, mainstream economics at least has become very, very insular, and from that insularity, they only produced ideas that are conforming to the status quo, and then those ideas are what the media runs with, and that becomes the common sense of the society, right? So I think that's probably why, or at least that partly explains probably why we see this myth persist.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the Nobel Prize, because that that really helps explain the recent the Nobel Prize going to, I won't name her, but a person that is totally devoted to regime change and
Right.
privatization, and so that explains that. But going back to the sort of global North, global South situation that we were discussing. Uh, in what ways have global North entities, I'm thinking the International Monetary Fund, the EU, the United States, major corporations, how have they actually blocked global South initiatives for economic independence and greater sovereignty? So, what does that economic warfare look like, and what are some of the consequences? Because you'd brought up Mossadegh, and I also think of Salvador Allende, for example, like nationalizing copper. Um, and these things were attacked not because they were failures, but because they were successful. And so, like, I'm just, if there are examples of how today they these efforts are still undermined by the forces of the global North that I'd mentioned. What do they look
Yeah.
like today?
Yeah. Of course. Yeah. This is another great question. I think there has been recently a lot of reporting on the budget deficits and the requirements for international assistance by a lot of smaller countries in the world. And what these analyses have shown is that the component of debt, particularly international debt, like debt from the IMF, but also other lenders outside, like so could be any financial institution in the developed world, that is that share of the budget for global South governments is continuing to grow and grow, and for some countries, it's even as much as 50%. Right? So, like, think about that. Like half of your budget is just going to service the debt that you have. Like I originally come from Pakistan, and I remember looking at the figures from last year for the budget for the country when the budget came out, and 50% more, I think slightly more than 50% actually, like 51% or something, was devoted to just interest payments on the debt. Right. So just imagine how much your fiscal space is reduced in doing any kind of development project. Right. Let's say you wanted to build new schools. Let's say you wanted to build new hospitals. Let's say you wanted to build a transportation network, whatever. You could have done all those things, but because literally half of your budget is going towards servicing debt, and this is just interest on debt, that's not even making a dent in the principal, by the way. So if half of your budget is going towards such high expenses that have nothing to do with development, then how can your fiscal space be completely independent, right? So in this way, the debt relationship and the debt dependency of global South countries on global North, that really hampers economic sovereignty and eventually political sovereignty as well, right? Because once these countries are in this dependent position, then they have to agree to certain kinds of deals that might not be in the that in fact not might they're surely not in the interest of the masses and the population of this country. So in this day and age, I think the debt relationship between the global North and the global South is one of the prime drivers of economic warfare, and that's what's blocking economic sovereignty for global South countries. Because as we've seen over the past 2 to 3 decades, much of the actual production actually happens in the global South now, right? During the neoliberal regime, global North countries moved all their productive facilities to the global South to exploit cheap labor there. So it's not like those countries are still making those things. The countries are the global South countries are the ones that are making the things themselves. So the main hurdle really for economic sovereignty for them remains this debt relationship, this ownership of the productive capacities by the global North firms, right? So even though the productive capacities have moved to the global South, other than China, most of those facilities remain beholden to northern capital interests. So I think this debt relationship and this northern control of the global value chains, I think these are the main vectors of creating hindrance to economic development of the global South and allowing them some sovereignty.
And I've been reading this report from the Tricontinental that was published last year, and it's talking about hyper imperialism. And one of the sections towards the middle and end is about how all these practices are kind of it's this imperial boomerang thing where actually the working classes of global North countries even are impacted by this pro-austerity, anti-independence, these projects inflicted upon the global South. And what we're seeing, I live in the States, so just here we see this decreased standard of living. We see really authoritarian political crackdowns on the public, all these different things, including now recently, people's SNAP benefits and different things that they rely on day to day are being cut and actually ceased completely because of this government shutdown situation. But so I wanted to ask you about that. Like, how are working people in the global North even impacted by, again, this imperial boomerang? And what do you think we can expect, for example, as the U.S. is ramping up what looks like even perhaps military attacks on China, and not just economic, but even the U.S. response to BRICS and what appears to be their preparation for even a full-on invasion of Venezuela.
I think that's kind of what we're seeing with Trump's deployment of the National Guards or the ICE agents running around and basically lawlessly kidnapping people, and that's very much linked to the neoliberal pro-austerity agenda. I think this all has happened, which is very visible. But there are other things that are also happening in the economic sphere as well, right? Like if you look at the housing market, that is completely tanking, whereas previously the state would have taken a role, like and after the Second World War. You saw the United States government significantly expanding the public housing stock to house its people, even though it was done not very inclusively, but still at least a big chunk of the masses was included in that project. So you look at youth unemployment, you look at healthcare services, particularly after COVID. So what you see is that, and even in the economic realm, this very austerity agenda has hurt workers a lot, and abroad it's being used to justify further extraction from global South countries, like whether it is in the name of resources or it's in the name of debt. It's the same process that is playing out in different geographical locations. So I think it's important to understand that these are both linked and they're parts of the same process.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about because there is kind of this debate going on about whether we're still living in neoliberalism or if we've moved on to a different stage of capitalism. And I wanted to ask your opinion on that, and also what the impact of neoliberalism has been on the political arena, because during the heyday of deregulation, austerity, privatization, which has persisted, though it definitely had an impact on politics. You had these massive industries in these private enterprises that effectively took control of the state. And I'm wondering if you see, one, like, I guess, like what does that look like when you have like sort of the economic agenda established by private industry, and two, whether you think that because we've kind of seen this failure of neoliberalism, especially I think the COVID pandemic, I think for a lot of people that was a wake up call, in that private enterprise is not, it is just not prepared to maintain organized human life. So I'm wondering if, like, do you think that we've effectively moved beyond neoliberalism into a more a different type of capitalism?
Yeah, I think that's this. You're right that this debate has been going on. It seems to be that now we are in a different phase where the state is becoming more active, but not in the way that you would want it to. The state is becoming more active to even further protect the interests of capital, right? So the exact opposite direction that we would want it to. So yeah, I suppose during the neoliberalism era, you would want the idea was that the state would be more behind the scenes, and it would be private actors would be doing most of the economic activity. But now what you see is that the state is again trying to reassert itself as the crises have become more and more sharp, right? So I think it's just a response to the evolving conditions. I suppose you could say that we do live in that era now. As they say, the center is not holding anymore, so it's either the extreme left or the extreme right. We've seen the previous era where at least in the US, there were two parties who both endorsed capitalism, right? They just talked about better management of it, or different ways of managing it, but both agreed largely that the private sector should be the one to deliver. And now there's this difference with a more you might call a harder state, so to speak, where you see. You must have seen the news around Trump administration taking stakes in private companies, like to secure access to critical minerals, right? So I think that it is a qualitatively different stage that we are in now, but I think it has emerged out of the failures of neoliberalism, right? Failures of neoliberalism in the sense that it has not delivered for people, for the common people. I think neoliberalism was very successful in delivering for the capitalist classes with the bonanza of profits that and then this and the excessive concentration that happened within the capitalist past. You see more and more mergers and acquisitions during that time, and now you are left with very, very few corporations who effectively run the state, and who can call on the state to be violent if need be, right, and like physically violent. So I think, yeah, it's fair to say that we are in sort of this post neoliberal stage, which has come out of the contradictions of neoliberalism itself.
Definitely, and it's interesting. Just one example of that. This sort of the state still working on behalf of private enterprise, but uh, it also acting violently on its behalf, which has been the case, so long as capitalism's been around. But the CEO of Union Pacific, there's an article that came out a little while ago, was the one who told Trump to send the National Guard to Memphis. So it's in a very real way, they have him by the ear and saying, hey, here's what we need you to do for XYZ reasons. Appreciate you elucidating on that, and talking about all these things and these issues that we are facing as working people. I wanted to kind of maybe transition to like a positive or hopeful, or maybe strategic note that, what do you think working class people and, their organizations, whether they're unions or grassroots groups, can do to support global South initiatives for economic independence, as well as effectively fight for meaningful popular economic political change in the global North?
Right. I think what working class people and their organizations need to do is, at least in the global north, I'm assuming that that's the question is more geared towards people in the global north, because that's where your podcast is. So I think they need to have an internationalist outlook in these organizations. Too many of these have like these very local, limited outlooks. They're not deeply connected to the labor movements, like the broader global labor movement I'm talking about. Maybe they're connected to the local labor movements, but not so much with the global left. So I think these connections now need to be developed, and if they're already there, then they need to be deepened. I mean, I'll give an example of my own union when I was a public servant in Canada, in Toronto. So this union, they had a very limited outlook. Like, they were only interested in winning the wage gains that, as inflation was eroding away real wages, they were interested in wage gains. They were interested in securing good working conditions for the people. So particularly after the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about bringing people back into work, right? And the union fought back against those kinds of arbitrary rulings, proposing that if work is being done at a similar or higher level than before, then there's no need. So their struggles were there, but they did not develop them into linking with the internationalist left, right? So I think this is something that needs to happen. I think during the initial tariff wars between Canada and US, I think I read something from Sean Fain where he was talking about, yeah, we need to secure good working conditions for our workers, and so this is good that Trump is doing these trade wars and these tariff wars. They're good for the workers, for the union that I represent. So I thought that there was a little bit of this localism happening, which I think if we continue down that road, then I don't think that we'll be able to develop the movement that needs to develop for the challenge that we face, because the challenge is of a planetary scale, right? The planetary climate crisis is not going to care about if a union has secured good working conditions for people in the United States or in Canada or in one particular country. It has to be global. So I think that would be my main I guess suggestion to working class people and their unions, to get deeper involvement with the global left.
Thank you so much. And before I let you go, I wanted to make sure, Is there anything you're currently working on, or is there anything you'd like to plug that people can check out? And where can folks find more about the work that you do and some of the stuff that you've been working on?
Right. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Yeah. I would like to plug the project I'm working on. It's called Project Real. The website is postgrowthreal.eu. It's a project that is trying to develop a realistic pathways towards a post-growth transition. I'm also a member of a grassroots organization in Canada called Spring. So if any of your listeners are from Canada, please check them out. They do a lot of good work on the ground from obviously a progressive perspective. And my Twitter account is OT_eco, as it means Omer Tayyab _ ecological economist. I generally don't tweet like myself more. I'm more I guess an aggregator in that sense. I retweet good content from a progressive perspective. So please check that out.